but my name is Bishop Kevin Strickland, and I serve as the Bishop of the Southeastern Synod for the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. For those of you not part of this denomination, what all that means is we have territory of Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Alabama. It's great to be with you. This is, Pastor Michael, I believe the fourth lectionary study we've done this year, and we've been highlighting female theologians from around the country and have really enjoyed the richness and the fruit of the vine that we've been able to glean from these theologians. So today, as no different than others, but a very special treat, Dr. Teresa Brown will be our teacher today, and we're so excited to have her with us. The nice thing about Zoom is that it allows us to not have to travel, and we're able to literally be from all over the United States and be able to enjoy the richness of the fruit of this teacher. So I am so thankful to you, Dr. Brown, for joining us today and making time for this as we get to study God's Word. I will open up with a word of prayer, and before I do that, I want to say thanks to each of you. Pastor Michael Jeanette, who's assistant to the bishop for formation and communication, is on with us today as well, and he will put a link if you wish to donate to our formation fund so that we can continue doing these types of events. You're welcome to do that. We'll continue to highlight female theologians for the rest of this year in lectionary studies. I don't have the next one lined up yet, but give me a week or two and hopefully I'll have that ready for you. But without further ado, I will go ahead and pray, and then Pastor Michael Jeanette will introduce our guest lecturer for this morning. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Our good and our gracious God, we give you thanks so much for this day, for the joy of creation that shines all around us. And yet we hear the groaning pains in other parts. We pray, O God, for the peace of Jerusalem. We pray, O God, for the places in our country ravaged by strife or warfare, of civil indifference, of racial injustice, of disequity and inequality. Guide and direct our hearts, O God, so that we may be pursuers of justice and agents of change. All for your love's sake, we pray. Amen. Pastor Michael, I'll hand it over to you.
Yes, thank you. Yes, once again, Pastor Michael Jeanette, assistant to the bishop in the Southeastern Synod, and also technical host. So if you have any issues with Zoom, things that go wrong, just please feel free to send me a private chat, and would love to help you out. Yes, the Reverend Dr. Teresa L. Brown is the Bandy Professor of Preaching, a chaired professorship created in 1986 with a gift from B. Jackson Bandy that is considered by many to be the country's premier chair in homiletics. Brown has taught at Candler since 1994, and in 2010, she became the first African-American woman to attain the rank of full professor. She also served as the director of Candler's Black Church Studies program until 2015. So Reverend Dr. Teresa Brown, we're glad you're here with us, and we'll turn it over to you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Good morning. And I want to thank Bishop Strickland for the invitation, and hopefully I'll do what I'm supposed to do. Because I'm talking about preaching the lectionary, I, as a homiletics professor, will start with some little reminders for us as we're going through. We will take a break. I think if I'm going too fast, somebody tell me. I get excited when I talk. If I'm going too slow, tell me, because I don't want you to go to sleep because it's early on Monday morning. And so if there are questions that you might have, or a need to expand something while I'm talking, please put that in the chat, and it will be sent to me. You can text it to me if you want to, because I'll be doing a lot of stuff. All right, so we'll work that way. So good morning, good morning, good morning. Classes are over, but since we're here, we'll keep it moving, right? Let's see. You're able to see my screen, right?
Yes.
Thank you. All right. So one of the things that I always begin with is, if we're going to be looking at text, we want to consider many of the things that we're going to go through when we're looking at these texts today. And we have 5 texts that we're going to be going through. So this is just a little refresher course. I always look at the text with intentionality about who is God in the text, because sometimes we keep God locked up into one kind of image or one kind of action. Who is Christ or Jesus, depending on how you're saying these things in the text. And we're going to be dealing with New Testament text. So we want to know what characters, what attributes, what actions you see about Christ in the text. Also, depending on where you're from or your denomination, or your beliefs, what is the action of spirit? And you may or may not see it, may not be obvious, but that's something else that comes up a lot. Because you are preachers, what is the church? What's the context? Where are you going to be delivering this particular message? And what does it mean? Because we're going to be talking about some healing texts or accessibility to God. What does it mean to be a human being made in God's image? Because these questions are going to come up as we go through, I think, the last three texts when we're talking about the healing miracles and the kingdom text. We also want to consider, who am I this morning when I'm looking at these texts? I often talk to the preachers in my classes and when I do conferences about, who am I today? Am I in love with God? Do I not like God? Do I have questions? Am I disgusted? All of those things come to the way we view the text when we're approaching it. And you can read the text over and over and over and over again, but who's Teresa today when she looks at the text? What kinds of things do I expect from the text? This impacts whether we are exegeting the text or we're eisegeting the text. Am I cramming all my stuff on top of the text, or am I letting the text breathe and get the information to me? As I'm going through today, it's also important to know I write commentaries. Commentaries are for the moment I'm looking at the text. I have no clue about who you are 15 years later looking at the text. So you become the commentator in your particular area, in your particular context, with your people, with who you are at that time. You are the commentary. A commentary that is published is just your conversation partner. It's just your conversation partner. So you'll see one of my questions, or what are my sacred texts? We have conversations with students and pastors and preachers about, can I use more than the Bible? So I don't know what your particular stance on that is, but there are times when a poem might become your sacred text. There are times for me that I'm inspired by a song that becomes what I meld with the sacred text that I believe is the biblical text. My conversation partners are, who do I even talk to about what I'm doing? We're going to be doing that today. I'm going to be your conversation partner, one of your conversation partners. And because there are millions of you online, we can't do small groups today. So you're going to have to do your conversation partner with me today in the chat. But who do I talk to about this? I usually ask people to, as you're going through, because you're so busy, and there's a whole thing about pastoring, what you're doing in preaching, is who am I able to talk to when I run up against a block in a text? Can I call someone? Do I trust someone enough to say, I'm having difficulty with this text. What do you see in the text? So who's your preaching partner? Who do you talk to? Where do you get your information? This becomes even more critical today in this particular frame that we're living in this time existentially, because there are persons that instead of looking at, I don't know what's going on with my computer right now, but I don't want to update. Instead of looking at the biblical text and opening the biblical text and letting it breathe, they just go online and pull something off and use it, which may or may not have anything at all to do with the reality of what's in the text. And we're not crediting sources and things of that nature. What is your creative process? Today, I'm going to talk through some ways that I approach a text and some ways that so I want you to consider how you prepare for a text. If I run up against a hard part in a text, I get up and I dance, or I sing, or I walk away, right? And sometimes we just sit and stare and stare and stare, and it seems like we don't get this sermon until 5 minutes before we preach it. But what is your creative process? And know that it's yours. And so sometimes I'm here and I'm like, okay, God, I prayed, and God said nothing that I can hear right then. It's in the text too, we're going to look at. So sometimes I just get up and I'm dancing around the room, and fortunately I live by myself, so I don't offend anybody. But at times, this is what we have to do. So think about how you create. You may be a person who cooks or paints or walks. Those things become important. And lastly, as I'm going through, how do I handle critique? this is very complex. It's not just the external critique when somebody hears your sermon, but if you are writing something and in the spirit you're told to change it, are you able to do that? Or are you one of those persons that say, I wrote this sermon, I'm going to preach it the way it is, I don't care what else has, because it's my work. So how flexible are you as you're going through, I think is the question that I'm probably asking us to consider. What is God doing in the text? I'm looking at this text. What do I see God doing? What is God doing even behind the text? Are there some larger things going on that I go with a preconceived notion of the text because I'm familiar with the text, but what do you see God doing in the text, right? What's going on? Is there condemnation? Is there some kind of law? Is there identification with human failing? All of those are in the 5 texts that we're going to go today. What has changed or what's commanded or demanded of humanity in the text? Is there any hope in the text? And my God, I hope we find hope everywhere. But is there hope or grace or good news or healing? We were looking at 4 healing texts. Is there mercy? And how do I define those things? What for me is healing? What for me is mercy? What for me is empowerment? And sociologically, I think that we get mixed up and we think that we empower people. No, people empower comes from them. It's like exegesis, right? We empower people when we put power on them, but empowering. What is that like? Is there any grace? All right, these things come up. And does the text indicate what God does to enable change? We do a lot of self-help preaching where it's, this is what you're going to do, it's going to change, but what is God changing in us? What is God doing? All right, so it's another way to look at the text. What goes on beyond the text? What's in the larger story of the text? And so you will, when we're going through these, I will say things like who's left out of the text? Who's quiet in the text? Who has power in the text? What's the larger setting? Because I know you all do this. The first text that was given me was John 3:17. Well, we're going to go before and after John 3:17. Because if you just choose one verse, you may miss the very important things that are supposed to come out of the focus text, right? What does it tell us about who God is? Or have done that? What are we asked to believe? So when we're preaching, what are we asking people to believe about God? What do we see in the text that is our theological blend? What is in that text? What does the text say about cross and resurrection? And we have a couple of texts that are going to talk just about that. And what is your main point of this sermon? As we're going through and looking at these, what exactly is the purpose? And you all know that because you're preachers, so you know that, right? All right, so the authority of the text, is this a text that you believe is ordained, inspired by God? What is your authority? Do people believe you when you're preaching just because you're the preacher? Or because you said you were called? Those kinds of things. Biblical text, what's the context? I've done that. What are the expectations, what you're working with this particular text that we're looking at? What are the expectations coming out of the sermon? And who is God in your church, in your community? Okay. These things become critically important as we're going through. All right. Basic things we're going to look at in each of the texts is what has God done? What is God doing? What will God do? In all 5 of the texts. What has God done? What is God doing? What will God do? We're going to remember backward on some of these things, what came before the text, and that tells us something about what God has done. We're going to look at the promise of God. We're also going to set with the mystery of God. For preachers, I think this is the hardest thing because we like to tie everything up in a nice little knot at the end of the sermon and say, okay, go forth, it's wonderful. But sometimes there's no answer in the text. So we have to learn to live in the mystery of God. So we have what has God done? That's the historical basis of it, right? The background of the text. And the mystery of God is God's actions and how is God with humanity? The promise of God is the future resurrection and future expectations. And how do you establish trust with the congregation when you can't give them a pat answer for everything? So those are some of the things we're going to consider. We're also going to be considering imagination. I don't, what kinds of ways do you use hymnody or poetry or tradition or prayers to substantiate what you're doing in the sermon? Emphatically, how do you imagine yourself? Imagine ourselves in somebody else's shoes. So one of the texts we're looking at today has to do with healing. Well, three of them do. But how do you imagine yourself in the position of the people in the text? Can you imagine yourself in that? Can you imagine, as Gardner Taylor said, can you imagine to put yourself in the seat of the listener, and what they are now receiving while you are preaching becomes critically important, right? And then can you see or respond to new things? What kinds of things are we saying when we are preaching that we want people to, we're persuading, that's a rhetorical device, right? That we want to persuade people to see the vision that God has given us in the text. How are we finding language to do that? That's the richness of the sermon. And then finally, what is our moral imagination? How do we look for equality? One of the texts, I think our last text we're going to look at, has to do with moral imagination, because we're looking at a woman who didn't have access, and then a wealthy person's daughter who had access. And what does God do with equality? That's part of moral imagination and the wisdom of that is. So I think I've set up enough. I'm going to ask you to also, at time to time, I will ask you to put in the chat some multisensory interrogation of the text. And so I will ask you questions of like, what do you hear in the text? What do you see in the text? What do you feel in the text? What do you smell in the text? What's the tactile, kinesthetic kinds of things? So you're going to be engaging. And this particular piece will also help you with the illustrations in the text. What do you see? What do you hear? What do you taste? What do you smell? How can you feel something? And what's the movement in the text? That way you don't have to go online and pull an illustration that somebody else used that doesn't have anything to do with the text in the first place. These things come up and will help you with your earthing the text, all right? So I may be asking, I may stop. In fact, I'm going to make it a point to put a note on my computer to stop so we can do some multisensory engagement in the chat as we go through the particular text for today. I know you all read, so I don't have to talk about the importance of reading because you're here today, so you read. So we will jump past that and go to the text. Marvin McMickle, in stating the claim of the sermon, talks about when we approach any text, that we need to look at how much of the text we're going to use in the sermons. In the chat, I don't know how long you all preach. Please don't tell me 45 minutes. I will be so upset. In the chat, could you please put how long your sermons are? One of the hardest things that I've had to do during the pandemic is working with preachers who are preaching 45 minutes to an hour and helping them move down to under 25 minutes because people were getting so fatigued they weren't following. So anybody that put an hour just lied to me today, so I won't be disappointed in you, okay? Just put down you do 5 minutes or 10 minutes, right? So the limits, how much of the biblical text am I going to use in this sermon? How much of it am I going to use? What's the genre that we're looking at? A lot of what we're doing today are narratives, but what's the genre? So I'm going to talk about stories within a story. What's the genre of the text? What is the original language of the text? It doesn't mean that you go back and you have to do an entire sermon saying, and the Greek says this, and the Hebrew says this, and then you impress people because you can actually pronounce the word because you went online to learn how to do it, or you had to have the class when you're in seminary. But what is the language of the text? Is it close to the original language, which gets to which translation you are using for what you're doing? I'm going to be using the Common English Bible today when I have the text up on the board, up on the screen, but what are you using? How close is it to the original language? And when you start the work on the text, I pray you're not using a paraphrase version. I love the message, but that's not where you start when you're writing a sermon. You can get to the message when you're getting ready to preach it, or the voice translation, but go to something like Common English or even King James with all of his errors, NRSV or NIV, something like that, but don't start with a paraphrase version. The text, the listener, and the preacher. When you're writing this sermon, you already know you have the text, we have the people that we're writing for, and we have the preacher, but most importantly, we have God telling you what you're supposed to preach. Are there some similar texts? From time to time, I'm going to tell you that this text is also here, here, and here, but there are differences in those translations. That's what you do. And all of you have gospel parallels, I know, or you can get them online if you don't want to invest in them. What are the characters in the story, of course, are the leads. So look at the characters. What is the intent of the story in the first place? And we're back at the mystery of God because sometimes we don't know the intent. And then how does the text shape where we are contemporarily? That's the life application, not the life application Bible, but how is that shaped? How are we moving towards something? Are we preaching just because it came up in the lectionary today? Or are we preaching because there's something there? That when that group got together 15 years ago to decide what this was going to be, what do I see now? And whether it's moving through Pentecost or it's ordinary time, there's something, I believe, in every piece of the Bible, in every verse of the Bible that tells us something about application, even the genealogies, if we want to do that, right? So we're looking at those kinds of things. So who is God? What's in the text? And how shall we preach the text are the three things that we're going to do. What's in the text, what's through the text. We're going to try not to preach everything in the text. Who's speaking? What's the power dynamics, the background people, what's inferred? So we go to the first text. The first text that was given to me was John 3:17. Gail O'Day, the late Gail O'Day, who was a wonderful friend, and those of you who went to Canada knew Gail O'Day, warns that reducing something to one verse can rob it of its richness. And so she advocates that we move back and go through the story of Nicodemus and then go down to 17 and understand that sometimes people wring the meaning out of a text by only reciting John 3:16, right? And we don't know anything that came after that. So we're going to go through. So my advice is that we go through. And the story follows this pattern of a person asks Jesus a question. Jesus gives a question that is hard to understand, like I'm sure my 8 o'clock students think I do all the time. Then the person misunderstands what's going on. Then Jesus answers even more cryptically, and then there's a discourse. So we have this pattern of these encounters with Jesus. Yesterday, I preached the text about the woman at the well, and that was the longest discourse, 13 exchanges with Jesus. But there's always there's a question. And like Jesus knows the question is coming, but there's a question. And here we have, of course, Nicodemus, and you already know that story. And it's a whole thing about birthing, about do you have to enter in again? Those kinds of things come up. And in this particular text, if we're going to look at the Pharisees, so we already know there's some oppositional groups in the text, right? There's information early on in the text about the difference between night and darkness. Darkness is associated with evil and separation from God. Nicodemus comes at night because he's separated from God. He may admire Jesus like many people did, but he doesn't want to follow in public. And we have people in our congregations, whether we're online or in person, who are kind of like, I'm old enough to say the back row people, right? That don't want to be up so people can see how they're expressing themselves. And now I call them keyboard cowards, but they're people that kind of set back and don't want you to really know what's going on in their head. And so there's this whole discussion in this exchange with Nicodemus and Jesus' response about pneuma, about the spirit, about the ambiguity of where spirit is. And contemporarily, we have so many people that think they control the spirit. This is a good text to begin with before we get to God didn't send his son into the world to judge the world, but that the world might be saved through him. Now, we know that we have had in the last longer than 5 years, but there's this constant in social media attacking someone about who owns God and who owns the word and what the whole purpose was. And so here, the conversation is about the incarnation, because in this Nicodemus, I need to move something so I can see my notes. All right. There we go. In this discourse, there are these sayings about eternal life. And so I began by asking us to consider what we think eternal life is. We know that Nicodemus, as I said, is a sympathizer, a follower of Jesus. He's a ruler of the Jews, and he had good intentions, but not strong faith. So when we go to 15 in John 3:15, that whosoever, that's everybody, believes should not perish, but have eternal life. It's Jesus is using this word pas, everyone, who serves as a hint that the gospel is not limited to one group of people. It says whosoever. There's a church in Memphis called the Whosoever Church that sometimes we find in our faith talks that we set up barriers to limit who has access. Jesus is saying here, whosoever will, right? So one of the topics is who's the whosoever? Who are the faithful? Who are the people that can believe? Because Nicodemus is falling far off, but still gonna have a conversation with Jesus. This is, in this particular text, since you're doing Trinity Sunday here, in this particular text is the first mention of eternal life. And it's mentioned thereafter about 17 times. 15, Jesus is saying this, the word and the life. And it appears to, we have all this stuff about, if you do this, you'll have eternal life. What exactly do you mean when you're talking to your people about what is eternal life? O'Day seems to think that it's not then and there, but it's now. Her work is that eternal life is what we do in the presence, the unending presence of God. Because she says, if you look at the tense of that line, I know you're looking in your Bibles right now, look at the tense, it's not future, it's present tense, right? He that believeth will have seems like future, but thereafter, when Jesus is talking about it, he's talking about present tense. In 17:3, when we get over there, this is eternal life he talks about. When he says, I am, that's present tense. And so sometimes we think eternal life is what you do after you do all these other kinds of things. But O'Day is talking about it's the here and now. That new life is promised to Nicodemus in 3:3 and 3:5. Very truly, I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God without being born from above. And so he starts talking about new birth and this birth narrative that's there, that even though he's having this conversation with Jesus, we also have to understand, and maybe this helps us in church sometimes, that Nicodemus will later on, by John 7, conspire to have Jesus arrested. But something is still drawing him to Jesus. So then the question becomes, at what point in time do we believe? At what point in time are we drawn in? At what point in time do we begin to understand? So this is raised throughout these 5 passages that we have. At what point in time does one come to faith? And what does faith mean? And what does faith do? And what are the actions that one has when one begins to believe? And here we consider, even as we get past this 17th verse, let me back up. 3:15, that whosoever becomes very important. First mention of eternal life. Then we move past that. We know John 3:16, it's on t-shirts, it's on bumper stickers and all that other kind of stuff, right? We're talking about here God, Father, and Spirit in this particular passage, which is why it's used for Trinity Sunday. We often say we're looking at life after death in the spiritual realm. We're in the 5th chapter of John, it shifts to life is given to those who are dead in the future. But it also speaks about the present life. 3:36, we don't quite get there right now, but it means living in the unending presence of God. So put 3:36. When I say you have to read all of it, I think you get the essence of what's said in 3:17 if you read the passage before and you read the entire discourse, as O'Day says, right? Ask yourself also, not only what is eternal life, but what does it mean to be condemned? What is condemnation? Here in this text, it means judgment. And it says that Jesus came not to condemn, but through him, the world might be saved. So sometimes people lodge on the judgment, the condemnation word, instead of looking at that was not the purpose. The purpose was to provide a means for, in our present actions, to move toward eternal life. This text is also one that is very rich in telling us something about what it means to have choices. What are the faith choices of the believers when we read the text? It's called, this Trinity Sunday is sometimes called the Idea Feast, where it's about God wanting to be near us, which is why God sent the Son. It's God's, the Emmanuel is, right? We talk about God with us. And so God didn't have to do that, but God's desire to be near us, to perhaps then, and this is my own hermeneutic, perhaps we could feel the breath of God then, because sometimes God seems very distant. And so in making choices, as Nicodemus could make a choice, our people can also make a choice. We can make a choice about what is new life in this is a different kind of birth narrative, that God so loved, that God sent, right, for us to understand what eternal life is right now. And with all the death and destruction around us, it may be very helpful to talk about the isness of God instead of what's going to happen after a while. Because after a while, I think in the biblical text is not promised. And so we have to think through what is going on right now in the presence of God, in the I am statements of Jesus, that lets us know that God is with us when we're losing loved ones, that God is with us when we can't go outside, that God is with us when things don't go the way we think, and God is with us when everything's going well. So this text, I think, if we're going to consider here, again, I said the actions of God, we consider what is God doing, we consider the move of the Spirit in this particular text, and we consider the words of Jesus and the ideas, the doctrine that comes from that. So we have the doctrine of incarnation, we have a look at eternal life, we look at what judgment is and our present actions, and we look at our faith choices, which all the rest of those, I don't know how many of you do series preaching. Series preaching in these rich passages that you're looking at, this is the linchpin, but the series preaching is very effective as long as we're not repeating everything we said last Sunday, and gives a common thread, because there's a common thread from the Old Testament through Revelation. Even if you don't do the traditional start at the beginning and go all the way through, there's a common thread. And so what is the thread that you want the people, the listeners, the congregation, the people that are tuning in to follow? What is the common thread for you throughout the biblical text? It's like God repeats things over and over again because we're not good students and we're going to forget it sometime, but we keep this thread, this looping all the way through. And it's that God wants to be present with us, God with us, that eternal life can be now. By our actions, we establish where we're going to be, what we're going to be doing, and that we get these chances to do these things right, that it's set up that way because God understands we're not perfect, even though we think we probably are sometimes. Okay, I said I was going to stop and ask you something. I don't know if I can see the chat. Okay, I probably can't see the chat, so I'm going to trust you to do the work. I can't see the chat, okay? So if we just look, let's go back to, here we go. We're going to go right here, all right? Let's do, here's a word. What does salvation look like? Just put one word in the chat. What does salvation look like? Because the focus text, God didn't send his son into the world to judge the world, but the world through him might be saved. Let me back up. I want you to put in the chat, what does judgment look like? That's where we're going to start. Just put one word for judgment in the chat. I see no fingers moving. Did we put it in the chat? Okay. What does judgment sound like? Put that in the chat. There we go. Now I can do this. Okay. What does judgment feel like? Now I'm going to have you do feel a different way. These are very good. If you could touch judgment, what does it feel like? If you could touch it, what does it feel like? Thank you. Okay. All right. Oh, very good. Okay. All right, we're going to move from judgment. Love. What does love smell like? Biscuits and gravy, okay. What does love sound like? Now I'm going to press your imagination just a bit. What does God feel like? If you could touch God, what does God feel like? Mm-hmm. Okay. If you could, how does salvation move? That's the kinesthetic part. How does what's the movement of salvation? How does salvation move? Oh, okay. Very good. Okay. Very good. Very good. Okay. Mhm. Okay, thank you. You have this down pat. This is a good group. If you could attach, now we're doing resources. Look at verse 17. God didn't send his son into the world to judge the world, that the world might be saved. This is, I just remembered I was going to ask this. The word that's used is cosmos. What's the world? Who's the whosoever? That's what I'm asking you. Whosoever. All creation. Okay. Thank you. Very good. And I press that question because sometimes we as preachers limit cosmos. And you're all very good Lutherans and other people because you have everybody. I'm just so proud of you. I just don't know. And even those we don't like, yes. And that becomes very important because we limit the text when we set up barriers to keep people from being who God wants them to be. Okay. Thank you. All right. I'm doing okay on time. Okay. All right, we're going to leave this one. I know you already have it down pat, but we're going to shift to the next text, okay? All right. This looks very small right now, but this is the one we're at. Jesus, again, this is a series. All of the last 4 texts are a series of parables, okay? He's summing them, speaking them in parables. You already know that in the New Testament, in the Greek and the Hebrew and all this, it means to be like or compare. So we're doing parabolic kinds of things. It's a saying that we know that requires a good deal of thought when you listen to it. It's like a puzzle for some people, but we're now looking at this. And so Mark is going to begin this presentation of juxtaposing one story with another, intercalation. And there's one story he's going to juxtapose with another. And in this particular one, I always find this one very interesting because in this particular text, and you already have this, Jesus is in a house and we don't know whose house it is. And sometimes we always want to say it's Simon's house. Simon's house is very busy in the biblical text, according to some of the commentators. And he's gathering the people around him, and the people don't have a lot to eat. There's always this very wonderful kind of, I think, we have the feeding of the 5,000, we'll have the feeding of the 4,000, but there's something about people coming to Jesus not for physical food, which seems to be the emphasis, but you come for something else. And I always find it very interesting in churches where to gather people, we promise them food. That's not what happens in the biblical text, right? We have to have a dinner, we have to have a potluck or something so people stay around for something. That is not in the biblical text. This again is people come together, and it says in this text, in that first verse, verse 20, that the crowd gathered and it was impossible for him and his followers to eat. There wasn't enough food, evidently, and you have to plan. In my particular culture, it's a sin to gather people without food, enough food, even if you don't eat. And so we go there. And so in this comparison and contrasting, this first story is the gathering of Jesus's family. So I think that you already know this, that legal experts are coming down from Jerusalem, and they keep saying he's possessed by Beelzebub. I'm going to break this out in a minute. He throws out demons, the authority of the ruler of demons. And Jesus calls them together and he begins to speak in this parable. How can Satan throw Satan out? A kingdom involved in a civil war will collapse. A house that's torn apart by divisions will collapse. If Satan rebels against himself and is divided, then he can't endure. He's done for. No one gets into the house of a strong person and steals anything without first tying up the strong person. Only then can the house be burglarized, right? This is the Common English Bible. I assure you that human beings will be forgiven for everything, for all sins and insults of every kind, but whoever insults the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven. The person is guilty of a sin. And he said this because the legal experts were saying he's possessed by evil spirits. First story. Second story, his mother and brothers arrive. They stand outside, send word to him, calling for him. And a crowd is seated around him, and those sent to him said, look, your mother, brothers and sisters are outside looking for you. He replies, who is my mother? Who are my brothers? Looking around at those seated in the circle, he says, look, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother, sister, and mother. So keep that open. Excuse me. We look at where the location of the story is. Jerusalem is in a mountainous area. Capernaum is north of that at sea level. And so the scribes, who again they're against Jesus, have to come down to where Jesus is. Very important power dynamic. The placement of people become very important, right? Jesus is here, and the people that thought they were above everyone have to come down to be in Jesus's presence. It's interesting when your enemies have to come down to attack you, right? And so they're up there, they come down to where he is, and they want to discount Jesus, this threat. They want to undercut his authority and saying, then they begin by saying he's working with Beelzebub. Some of you have been challenged with that. I received a message yesterday that someone said I was doing something equivalent to that. So we have to, in this story, within a story, this intercalation, it's to balance out perspectives. When I ask you to think about who's in the story, who's left out of the story, who's in the background. So let's start here. It says that Jesus' scribes from Jerusalem come to discount. Look at the first part of the text before we get to the piece about the family. Tell them in the chat, put who the main characters that you see. The characters up in front are whom? Put that in the chat. And then who are the characters in the background? Characters in front, characters in the background. Let me see if I can pull up the chat. There we go. All right. Who do you suppose is in that crowd? Politicians, thank you. Okay. Religious leaders, common people, okay. What are the ages that you think are present? Thank you. And we're fishermen and families. We're very clear that in the biblical accounts, the crowds are always larger than what one estimated because they didn't count women and children. There's usually a 4-to-1 ratio there. So it was a large crowd. Jesus has this method that he goes through of healing. Jesus calls out the faith, and this will be what we use later on. Jesus calls out calls upon the faith within the person. There are times when Jesus touches, other times Jesus does not. There's a problem, it problematized when we get to the last text because you're not supposed to touch a corpse. He has prayer, he assures the person of forgiveness and commands them to do something. Usually in Mark, Jesus is commanding them not to tell anyone that they're healed because there's a sequence of when he wants the messianic promise to be there. Calls upon the faith in the person, touches, prayer, assurance of forgiveness, and command. He, in preceding this, in chapters 1, verses 21, 28, he's healed a man with an unclean spirit. He healed people in Simon's house in the latter part of the first chapter. He's been preaching outdoor in Galilee. He's cleansed a leper in 140. He's healed the paralytic in the second chapter. He's invited a tax collector who was also ostracized because tax collectors seem to be against the people. So in the second chapter, he's invited the tax collector to follow him. He's been in a controversy with the Pharisees about fasting in the second chapter. And so that's one of the reasons they're against him, because they're always challenging him. And Jesus comes back with what's going on. In 3:1-6 of Mark, he's healed the man that had the palsied hand. And the crowds are pressing around him. And there's this thought that they're unclean spirits that are falling before him. And they're crying out for the Son of God. And then we get to Beelzebub, right? This name for this Philistine, a god of the Philistine city. I'm old enough to have read The Lord of the Flies. There was this thought that Beelzebub was the Lord of the Flies. And they began, the Jews, began using this terminology to mean something that was bitter and scornful. And they use it in reference to Satan. And so there are all these images of Beelzebub flying around like an insect. So he's the Lord of the Flies. And when he is like a sun god, but he brings the flies with him. But he can also be evoked to drive flies away. So he's the Lord of the Flies. Jesus refers to this character as a strong man. Okay. And so when we're looking at this, we have, someone said Beelzebub was present. It says that they said he must have the spirit of Beelzebub. So be very clear about that he says that in that first story. The discounting is, Jesus is saying, why would I use Satan to drive out Satan, right? That I'm using a different kind of authority to get rid of these particular spirits. And you're looking at it as if I am Satan. And that's what goes on in that first story when we're talking about the Jesus and the scribes and Beelzebub. And then the second story is family members. Now, all of you in ministry understand that sometimes people use your family to get to you. Every now and then they will use your family to get to you. And one of the things that we see there is, let me back up, the demons. When in the biblical text it talks about demons and unclean spirits, when you go back and research demons, they're physical demons that might be something like insomnia or self-inflicted wounds or blindness or seizures or muteness, something like that. There are emotional demons that have to do with fear, or in common day language, constantly crying about things, a loss of self-respect, or I use pity parties. There are social demons, dwelling in unclean places, abuse, oppression, domestic violence, objectification. There are spiritual demons of rejection of faith and the way we worship, or false praise. Those kinds of things come under the category of these demonic spirits or the unclean spirits. Instead of it just being the devil, there's some manifestations that you see when you study what it means by unclean spirits in the biblical text. Jesus tells them, I can go back to this, in verse 28, let me back up. I'm going to I'll come back to verse 28. But one of the things that in this text, we're looking at healing. Some people say Jesus was there for an exorcism. One has to be careful because we're talking about Jesus is mine. And in isms, some people have used this text to talk about mental health. I don't think that's very bright, or right, but to speak about God in these, because Jesus wasn't doing what they expected him to do. Then they started talking about blasphemy. They wanted to hurt his reputation by saying he was going against God, because again, they did not know, this is part of the mystery, that he was working against the Holy Spirit, that he was calling himself God or doing action he shouldn't do. So we look at that. So when one blasphemes, one speaks with contempt about something in relationship to God. This is a text that's also about faith because it's a healing text. It is a text that's about family because Jesus' family comes in, and we know Jesus' family and the brothers and sisters. I think I gave you their names. I just think it's very interesting, as you can see here. We have in Matthew the names of Jesus's brothers. So there's even a conversation about when were these Joseph's children before he married Mary, because some people believe in perpetual virginity of Mary, or did she have children after Jesus? That's for you to evaluate. I'm not going there right now. But the names that we find in Matthew are James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon. The sisters, God bless them, don't get names, as many times women do not have names in the biblical text. But they said that they came and had heard that Jesus was performing these miracles or talking to people or driving out unclean spirits, and the people were hungry and all these other things. And they said, he's getting beside himself. He must be sick, because families do that kind of thing. When somebody calls you and said, your sister Teresa is not doing right. And somebody will say, yeah, she must be crazy. She's being emotional. So they come there as a critique. And I think that we interpret that as they were joining in with the Pharisees, the scribes, but they were not. It's a family response. Maybe they thought he was being embarrassed, but remember, Jesus' family did not, even though Mary had been told, the brothers and sisters did not until after the resurrection come to any understanding about who their brother was, which usually happens in churches and families. And so this is a text also about allegiance to God. When they say that he's trying to be God, that he's being a blasphemer, it's allegiance to God. It's about the extent of God's promises, because he is, again, healing people that are undesirables. And there's some inside knowledge and some outside knowledge that we need to talk about. Jesus' listeners are sometimes outsiders, where they're just observing, when I say who's in the background. And sometimes the people in the background seem to me understanding more than the people up in front, like the disciples. That sometimes is a veiled message, because Jesus is not telling them to go tell anybody. So the message is kind of veiled. So we have that kind of thing as we're going through. And in this, when we're talking about the family members, Jesus says in verse 28, go to verse 28, go to verse 28, go to verse 28. When you see in a biblical text, when Jesus says, most certainly, when he says most certainly, Jesus says most certainly, or listen carefully, 31 times in Matthew, 13 times in Mark, 9 times in Luke, 25 times in John. This means this is really, really, really important. Whenever one is teaching, one uses repetition in order for people to attend to something. There's something that Jesus wants them to understand. And if we go back to the text and you look at verse 28, he says, I assure you. In another translation, he says, listen, this is something I want you. I assure you that human beings will be forgiven of everything from all sins and insults of every kind. But whosoever insults the Holy Spirit. But right here, 28, I think, is one of those verses that we need to look at because we seem to contemporarily castigate people for our own litany of sins. Instead of remember, they all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Or we decide that we're the judge and juror. But Jesus is saying that it has to do with a faith move, right? It has to do with being in a position to ask for forgiveness. And that's where the healing takes place. His mother and his brothers arrive. They stand outside. They send word calling for him. And the crowd seated around him and those who sent, look, your mother and your brothers are outside looking for you. Right? So they couldn't get in the house. That's what happens with Jesus. One of these days, our churches will be like that. They couldn't get inside, so they're outside. And then that's when he does this whole family. Who is family? Who's relational? Who is my mother? Who are my brothers? I'm looking around at those in his circle. He's saying those who come to me, those who believe, those who ask for forgiveness become the family of God. Right? They become the family of God. So this is not blood now. This is about relationship through faith. And so the first part of the story, the first story is about the legal experts who are not part of the family of faith right now because they're challenging everything he's doing. And then we get to even accusing him of being demonic himself. And then to underscore who the family of faith is, it's not the leaders that seem to be holding on and saying, we know everything there is to be about religion. He's about faith. He's saying, faith are the people that follow. Faith are the people that are seated in this circle trying to learn. That becomes my family, not just the people who gave birth to me, not just the people I go to church with. It's those that follow what God's will is. That's what you see in 35. Whoever does the will of God, God's will is my brother, sister, and mother. Okay. So it's not so much sometimes my family, my church. We're back at whosoever. This is the loop that's going to go through all of the texts for this season, is whosoever. So if you want to do a series called Whosoever, that is what you can do with the text that we're going right now. The whosoever of God becomes critically important. So we look at that location of the story, what's going on, but the story within the story. Jesus had a complex little family, and most of us in ministry do too. And so you make family in faith is what we're doing right here. Okay. Demons, sower. Okay. All right. Let's back up because I told you I was going to do this. We're in an area in this story, that first story. Let me go back. The people are in a house sitting close together. What does it smell like? We're back in the chat. What does it smell like in this story? What do you smell? There we go. What do you imagine the temperature is? The people are gathering, his followers are gathering. And I want you to think about the social structure during that time. Who's inside the house? one of the things, it depends on the commentary, it says that it's Simon's house. Poor Simon's house just gets a workout. Look at the structure of the houses. We understand there weren't windows, and so they had to have some air coming in. We have people that are outside. Who was outside the house? Who would be left outside the house? I'm not seeing that. Right. You are members of Jesus' blood family. How do you feel when Jesus says, who is my mother? Who are my brothers? And looking around at the people in the circle, he says, here are my mother and my brothers. How do you think they're feeling? And the reason I ask the question is because in our life of faith, there are times when one makes a choice between the family of blood family, who may not be where you are in faith development, and a faith family, but you still are part of both families. So that might even be a topic to kind of look at what that means. Whoever does the will, God's will, is my brother, sister, and mother. What does God's will look like? What is it? I wonder what it means to blood family when the preachers are so busy with the other family that they don't have time for theirs. It's a consideration. That we're in, if we're honest about ourselves, our lives as persons of faith are sometimes very strained. And this particular text even tells us something about that. You know, you're hearing something about your loved one, you're concerned about them, then it looks like you're joining in with everybody else to tear them down, whatever. And then the person says, this is my family right here. So we're looking at those kinds of things. So this is about family. It can be about, again, challenge to authority and the ways in people challenge your authority. What are ways that people challenge the authority of persons of faith? Right? This critique of, well, he's possessed by the devil, right? When there's a new policy in the church, when there's you get a revelation from God that you want to include somebody in the whosoever, that you want to add a new ministry or something of that nature, and you're going to hear the challenge of, there's something wrong with you, right? Those things come up, those things are real. So we're looking at this. Investigate before you preach this. What exactly does it mean for one to have an exorcism and for someone to be castigated as being crazy? What does that mean? And our language becomes important when we're talking about this kind of spirit possession. What is that? I mean, we're not going to do movies will have you, you know, we're in this era right now that every new movie comes out and somebody's walking dead or coming back to life or things of that nature. What does that mean? Because our people are listening and watching what's in popular culture, then how do you explain it in the biblical text? Okay. All right. I'm going to go through this text and we're going to, this particular one, then we're going to take a little break. Okay. I don't know if we're, oh, this is a shorter one because the longer ones are going to take us more time. All right. Jesus said this is God's kingdom, what God's kingdom is like. We're back at kingdom parables. All of these are kingdom parables. As though someone scatters seeds on the ground, then sleeps and wakes night and day. The seed sprouts and grows, but the farmer doesn't know how. The earth produces crops all by itself. Underline that part. The earth produces crops all by itself. Because sometimes we think growth is human agency, but the earth produces crops all by itself because things grow and we weren't around, right? First the stalk, then the head, then the full head of grain. Whenever the crop is ready, that becomes important. Whenever the crop is ready, the farmer goes out to cut the grain because it's harvest time. Let me back through this first. Kingdom parable. This is what God's kingdom is like. So we already know the parabolic kind of formula. It's as though someone scatters seeds on the ground, right? The focus is now from listening to the religious leaders that don't like us to parables that have to do with our growth and development, our understanding of what faith is, right? Scatters on our ground and then sleeps, wakes day and night. So it's a process, because now we're seeing some cyclical kind of biorhythmic kind of thing, that someone has scattered these seeds, but then you're human, so you're sleeping. So there's this day and night. The seeds sprout and grow, but the farmer doesn't know how, because we understand a lot through science. We understand a lot about those things. We have time-lapse photography. They didn't have that then, right? And so people didn't understand what was going on. And it says, he continues. Jesus is now in this discourse, rolling with the discourse, right? This is the second move of his sermon. What's a good image for God's kingdom? What parable can I use to explain it? Then he goes to mustard seed. When scattered on the ground, it's the smallest of all seeds on earth. It's really not, but that's what it says in the biblical text. And when it's planted, it grows and becomes the largest of all vegetables and plants. It produces large branches to the birds. Mustard seeds are actually a shrub, but there's a possibility with some pruning and things that it grows bigger. And the birds then lodge inside of it, make the nest, all right? With such parables, it continues and people were able to hear. So the focus is shifted away from the second chapter. We've gone through what those are all about, and now he's moving to more receptive crowd. It's easier to teach when people like you. It's much easier to preach when they like you, right? And so in chapter 4, he gives there are 4 parables that Jesus is going to give, has given in chapter 4, verses 1 through 20. So we're at the latter part of it. So he talks about the sower in 4, 1 through 20. Then he talks about putting the lamp under the bushel basket in 21 through 25. He talks about growing seed, is what we're talking about here in the first part. Growing, how seeds are growing, whether they're tended or you do something to impact the growth of that seed. And we're talking about mustard seed in 30 to 32. And then he's explaining why he's using the parables, right? He's in the crowd again. And he's telling the parable, but he takes his time with the disciples who become the insiders to explain in more depth when we get through 34. 3 of the 4 parables are about seeds and growing. And he's making a point on each of those. So you could do all 4 parables, do 1 a week, and still talk about sowing and seeds and growth and different types of growth, okay? He's talking about kingdom, and what that means. He's talking about scattered seed. Here he's talking about God bringing the way that seed grows is a mystery. It's one of God's mystery. The parable is found, this particular parable is in Matthew 13 and Luke 13. The kingdom of God is like a mustard seed in verse 31. That's metaphoric. And so it's a planting and sowing and harvest, but also talking about the growth process. I think that sometimes we think that people are converted and are instantly where they're supposed to be, but we don't give time for individual growth processes, right? And this mustard seed piece that we're talking about here, the smallest of all seeds, even in this language, it means that in the biblical text, what we find is small, ignored, insignificant beings become grow up to be something that people or someone that have a major kind of platform, or they're doing something big. Fred Craddock has said that we must be careful when we're preaching the name people in the Bible, because most of us will not get there. What this is telling us is that there's this old song from when my child was small called "Little Becomes Much When You Place It in the Master's Hand." I don't remember the rest of the song right now, but that's what this is about. This mustard seed is small, but isn't able to grow big to then even the birds are now lodging in it. It means that sometimes our beginnings are small, barely visible, and sometimes we inconsequential, but there's something about the work in God that makes it even bigger. It says that in this thing that it's sown, it grows up, it becomes great. It's sown, it grows up, it becomes great from a small seed. Faith is like that. So not only is it in people, but there's a growth process of faith. There's a planting and a sowing and a harvesting, but it doesn't start big. I think that's sometimes how we preach these things. It becomes really big. And in Matthew and Luke, it becomes a tree. And it's greater than the other trees. But it usually is a shrub about 12 feet high, right? Not 12, 10 to 12. It can grow to 10 to 12 feet, but it's usually a shrub. And then the birds can rest in it. This is a parable about kingdom. And I use kingdom, that should say D-O-M. I use kingdom because kingdom, for some people, has this power dynamic shift. Kingdom is the whosoever. That's where we are with that. And so in this particular text, scattered seed is the diaspora. That's whosoever, it's just out there. It grows sometimes unattended. Sometimes we seem to think that faith means that I'm always asking you, I'm doing this Aristotelian question and answer thing, and that gives you the discipline you need to grow. Sometimes faith grows and we don't even see it. We don't understand it. It's been planted, it's nurtured by God, it's the mystery of God, and it grows up. And sometimes the people have a stronger stronger statement of faith who are not in a church, who are not in a Bible study, than the people that are, because they're studying on their own, or they're in conversation with God, or they're praying, or whatever. So the seed is scattered, there's planting, there's sowing, there's watering, and God naturally waters. There are things that grow we know nothing about, right? We're still discovering flora and fauna and fish and everything else that we don't even have names for. God is still doing that with people. There are people that do not fit the mold that we have, but yet they are growing in faith. That comes out of this particular thing. The growth process, I'm going back to this, takes time. The question that will arise in my head is, what is God doing? Is, when is one converted? When does one have a statement of faith? I say this teaching in a seminary, when we spend the first year, those of you who've gone to seminary, it seems like every question, every class was, what's your call? And I tell people that I've been in ministry for 40 years and I'm still asking the question about what is my call and what God wants me to do, because it's still growing. We're still in process, but we like to have things, it's done and we move on. But this is about a process. This growth is like a process, right? And it has to be tended to with some care and love to become a small thing that becomes bigger, and for the kingdom to be realized. And so I'm going to back through the text. Okay. All the way through the text. Oh, I went too far. All right. What does growth sound like? What does growth sound like? You're in the chat, and I'm not seeing the chat. What does growth sound like? Breaking and popping, okay. Noise, creaking, drumming. Changed my mind about that, okay. Stretching, rest, silence. I like that, growth in silence, that's very good. right? A still small voice popping, vocalizing discomfort. My daughter practicing violin. All right. All right. Yeah. Okay. It says in verse 29, whenever the crop is ready, the farmer goes out and cuts the grain because it's harvest time. What does ready look like? What does ready look like? It says whenever the crop is ready. This gets back to my question about how do we know, a very pregnant woman, right? How do we know that faith is now manifest, right? Very good, lush and vibrant. The farmer knows. The farmer knows, okay. Okay, you'll know it when you see it. Standing on the edge of the pool, okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Need to watch, taste, and test, phone keys. Okay. All right. You're going to come up with wonderful examples when you're doing these tests. When you're preaching these texts, I can see it right now. It says in verse 27, the seed sprouts and grows, but the farmer doesn't know how. I wonder sometimes, what does that say about us who are supposed to be the shepherds of the faithful? How do we know that someone has developed? How do we know that someone is believing? How do we know those kinds of things? But this is what parables are for us to consider some things and go a bit deeper on something. We are going to break for 10 minutes. We'll come back at 10:30. Is that all right?
That sounds fine.
All right, let's do that.
Yeah, we invite everybody to take a couple minutes, stretch. You can turn your cameras off if you like, and then we'll announce our coming back together. I'll also have some music to share from an event last year. It has to do with musical heritage from our African descent ministry here in the Synod.
All right.
Hey, Dr. Fry Brown.
Hello, Walter Brown. I saw you in the chat. How are you doing?
I can't complain. Life is generous. So good to see you.
You're consistent. Yes, it's good to see you too.
Just about one more minute, folks. So if you might want to start making your way back to the computer, we'll just have a couple more seconds. Hopefully you got a good stretch and some coffee, water, whatever. You're welcome. About the music, that was from our African Descent Lutheran Association Southeastern chapter, did a presentation. So just wanted to lift up their gifts again here today. And Dr. Fry Brown, we turn it back over to you once again. And I invite anybody who has questions again, if you would post those in the chat session. We had one question. We had a couple that I think you kind of answered here and there, but I just want to lift up two. I'm going to put them back in the chat again, if that's okay, Dr. Fry Brown.
Yes, I was going to start this session with question and answers or the first part. So.
Okay, great. One's kind of a statement. It says topic that comes to mind: institutional, systemic jealousy or fear due to competition for influence. That was one comment. And then the other was who decides whether people's actions are in or out of the will of God? And so those who ask those questions, if you want to espouse more on that, just lift that up for you.
Are you talking? Okay. I think that is probably the point of the parables that we're looking at right now, is this jealousy, because the scribes were jealous of what Jesus was doing. And constantly throughout these kingdom parables, they're challenging him. And what comes to mind for me is one has to be ready with an answer. Not to tell them they're awful, but to know the narrative that they're giving you over and over and over again, because one is always under the threat of challenge. I always think it's very interesting that they're on Saturdays here, at least where I am, before the pandemic, there were persons that would come to my door on Saturday to tell me about their faith. And I would open the door and invite them in to sit down and talk about it, because I had an answer about my faith. Without ridiculing them or saying, why you're out here, one has to be ready to talk about what they believe. And that's what Jesus was modeling. Whenever even if he was speaking parabolically, whenever they had something, he had a comeback, a clapback, or whatever. Anyway, he knew what was going on. I think that's what we're told. It's one thing to say, I don't believe, but you have to tell people what you believe and why you believe it, and to have a theological basis for it more than the Bible says. Well, that was something written by human beings. What do you believe? And that's the question that I think comes up throughout the biblical text, but certainly throughout the New Testament, is what do you believe? Are you able to articulate what you believe without demeaning someone else? I think that's critically important. I mean, yeah, there was a text where Jesus called people broods of vipers, but I don't think we should do that every day, right? I think that we should be able to say, this is what I believe, this is why I believe it. And I say to my students, people want to know what you think, not just what you feel. And often our responses are feeling, not exactly what we know or think. Who decides whether people's actions are in and out of the will of God? I think God does. And I know that's really churchy, but I'm churchy. I think that we set up rules and regulations for other people based on our own fear, not on our faith. It's the competition. It's the whole piece about who's in charge, who gets to say what, who gets to be where, which is what our next text is our last text will talk about, who gets privy, who gets to be inside. Intertextuality in the Gospels and the Holy Spirit. One has to be very careful about, I asked you about looking at parallel texts, but there are times when people will bring something from the Old Testament and smash it into the New Testament and it doesn't fit. Or they'll put stories together. That's why I said we have to do close reads of text and look at the intentionality of the text in the context of that text. Where is it placed? Which is why I said read before and after, and not always jump to Isaiah is the most quoted prophet, right? But because sometimes we seem to just pull something from the Old Testament and put it with the New Testament because we see, because Jesus was in the beginning, that Jesus is throughout, but that doesn't always work. So one has to do a close read and look at some credible biblical scholars of the Old Testament and New Testament to see if they work together, if they work well. And if one is using an Old Testament text, please do not jump and end the sermon with Jesus just because your culture does it, your context does it. Make sure that there is a natural bridge to that it might be exemplary, that someone is quoting something from that. And I think that makes the sermon tighter without pushing something in, because we confuse people with our sermon structure sometimes, all the time. Well, sometimes we can confuse things by it. This is my favorite scripture, so I'm going to go ahead and put this in right here, but it doesn't fit. In like manner, our illustrations need to be bridges, not to overshadow the text, but to lead us to something else in the text, which is what the parables were doing right here. Okay. Any other questions? I'm scaring people off. I love that.
I think you're good. I think you touched on the ones that were posted here, but yes, we invite folks to share.
Okay. All righty. So we go to the June 20th text, which is this wonderful song called Peace Be Still that talks about this in many ways. But later that day, when evening came, later that day, that means he was doing something else. Again, we're in this series of parables. We're in the kingdom parables, right? So 8:35, there's a crossing of the Sea of Galilee. There's this back and forth between, there's several crossings mentioned in 4, 5, 6, and 8. There'll be crossings of the Sea of Galilee. This back and forth between the Jewish side and the Gentile side of the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus is performing healings and exorcisms with Jews and Gentiles, which we're at the whosoever, Jews and Gentiles. Jesus is no respecter of persons, literally, right? And there are these boat stories that we have that often we see in these boat stories that the disciples don't do too well. When Jesus walks on water in a windstorm, they're afraid and sick, and then they worry about having bread and all these other, the disciples need help, and we as disciples need help, because we say, help my unbelief, and sometimes our unbelief overshadows our belief. But so it talks about this later that day, he's done some other work, so now he's crossing again. Let's cross to the other side of the lake. We know that. They left the crowd. Again, you leave the crowd. And he got into the boat just as he was. And it says other boats were following. What we're going to see is after the work of ministry, I'm going to do this a little bit different, I think. After the work of ministry, there is a need for sabbatical. He's done this work. He's done the healing. Now let's go over here. They left the crowd, get in the boat, because Jesus was tired in his humanness. Pastors who are leaving in droves, particularly during this season, need to understand that you can't do 24/7 ministry. You have to go to the other side to get some rest, okay? That's my commercial for pastors and preachers, all right? They left the crowd and he took the boat just as he was. Other boats followed. Some commentators want to talk about there are other boats, so there are other boats out there. Why we focus on this boat? Other commentators said it doesn't make any difference, okay? So we have these boat stories. So they took him, they go into the boat. It's a boat that about 15 people can be on, with people rowing, and other small boats I've said are with them, and we don't know what that meaning is. And then a big windstorm comes up. A gale force winds arise, the waves crash against the boat so that the boat was swamped. We know that part, okay? Chat list. What does it feel like to be, in one word, what does it feel like, the motion of gale force winds on a boat? Into the chat, let's go. What does that feel like? What is the movement that's kinesthetic? What do gale force winds sound like? Okay. We're there, okay. What does one's stomach feel like when one is in a boat that is swaying? Okay. Shaking, all right? Got your descriptors going. It says, but Jesus was in the rear of the boat sleeping on a pillow. They woke him up and said, teacher, don't you care that we are drowning? Notice that they're calling him a teacher. which is positing him, and now he's going to teach us something. They're not saying master. Here the word is teacher. That becomes critically important, because Jesus can teach us things. The Spirit teaches us even in the midst of churning. The shalom, right, is the peace in the midst of stuff. So now there's a lesson coming up. It's a cue that there's a lesson coming up. Teacher, don't you care that we're drowning? And I find it interesting that some of us ask those kind of questions. God, where are you? Why don't you see what's going on with me right now? Even persons of deep abiding faith have these questions that come up. And the disciples are not pictured in a great light sometimes in these things, but we as disciples aren't either. When somebody writes our story, they're going to say, Teresa was a coward every now and then, right? She loved the Lord, but there are days that she just didn't want to get out of bed, right? So we have to think about those kinds of things. He got up, gave the order to the winds, and he said to the lake, silence, be still. The wind settles down, great calm. Jesus asked them, why are you frightened? Don't you have faith? We're back at a faith statement. Overcome with awe. Keep that in mind. Overcome with awe. Then they ask who he was. All right. Big wind comes up. We have that. We've done that. They're on the big lake, then the Sea of Galilee. And so now we look at what's going on. The disciples were insiders. They're in the boat with Jesus. They've seen Jesus do all these miracles, and they still have a question. They don't seem to get it, and some of them until after the resurrection. Some of us don't get our learning until 3 years after seminary. Some of us don't get it until we're in our 80s, and some of us never get it, let's be clear. So again, we're back. Belief statements are there. The need for sabbatical, the learning. They called Jesus a teacher, right? So there are all these books about get in the boat, Jesus in the boat, Jesus was sleeping, Jesus had to get up, Jesus was angry, but Jesus is now going to do a miracle that goes back. Somebody asked me about intertextuality, going back to the Old Testament about chaos, about in the beginning, the sea, the chaos, the belief that the Leviathan and everything else lived in the sea. And so it's raging. And so all of these feelings and emotions and why didn't we and what in the world we're out here for come up, because that's what happens when we're in the midst of a storm. It's about people languaging. The church was closed because we couldn't go in a physical building. And that was a faith quake. That was a faith quake. It wasn't that new, we didn't locate God just in the church. It was a faith quake. The disciples are having a faith quake in the middle of a raging sea. And Jesus uses the power by speaking peace. Fear, faith exists together. The shalom is there, and it shows God's power over nature. And then the question comes up, who in the world is this? So now they've been with Jesus. Now we're at identity and revelation. The insiders do not know. They don't remember, or fear has now blocked their knowledge. This becomes critically important when we're looking at these kind of texts. What does one believe? How can fear and change in circumstance change who we are? We're going to look at Jesus' humanness right now. What do you feel like when somebody wakes you up to ask you an inane question? A question that they should know. Yes. All right. Days. Okay. Uh-huh. Thank you. Because I think sometimes about how when my daughter was young and she wanted something and I was asleep, she would come and nudge me to get up and get something. And I wasn't pleasant all the time. And I wonder if sometimes in Jesus' humanness, Jesus was like, look, you just don't get it. What is this about, really? We talked about this already, right? We've had the conversations. You've watched me do this stuff. I'm trying to rest, and here you come. That's that interruption you have after a long day of ministry, and you go home and then your phone starts blowing up, right? And you have to get up, and you're not sometimes pleasant about it until you get there and know there has to be something. So they called him teacher. Jesus says, school is not out. Let me get up and show these folks who I am again. Gets up and just speaks. That's an enormous power. That again is a miracle. We love miracles. We love, or it was placid, right? Part of what people do when they look at that text, and I said that some people look at the other boats and some don't, is they were also in the gale. But the interest of many commentators is on Jesus in the boat with the disciples. And so now we look at the background players and what's going on in the background. Looking at who was watching the boat being tossed to and fro. What was the feeling of the people once that the sea was now quiet, that the windstorm was gone, that the wind settled down, and it says it was great calm. After tumultuous times in life, what does calm smell like? What does calm smell like? Thank you. After a period of death and destruction and potential death, what does peace feel like? If you could touch peace, what does peace feel like? Yeah. Thank you. When we look at in verse 39, when they've asked him this question, it says, Jesus, he got up and gave orders to the wind and said to the lake, silence, peace, be still. What do you imagine Jesus' voice sounded like when Jesus is saying, peace, be still? This is one of those texts that I think that in your sermon delivery, the way that you express both in volume and intonation, the words of the text carry as much weight as the words you use to describe the text. And that you can create an entire illustration of this text by the intonation of your voice. For instance, it depends on where you are, but this 39 where it's talking about, he got up and gave orders to the wind, and he said to the lake, silence, peace, be still. I wonder sometimes if he was shouting over, or if I'm going to say it, do I say, peace, be still? Because with that much power, do you have to shout? Right? It just kind of depends on how you're saying it. And then this other question, he understands who the disciples are. He has been with them. He knows they're a little slow and they're going to have some extra kind of work later on, a lot of extra work later on. It says the wind settles down. So the wind and the great calm is there. Then he asks, why are you frightened? He doesn't say, why were you frightened? He says, why are you frightened? because when our bodies are tense, it takes some time to come down from it, right? And sometimes it's like instantly this. It's kind of like that word immediately that'll come in the next passage. What do we mean by immediate? When does one become calm after they think their life has been threatened? Is it because we have authority that we now say something that everything is calm, or does it take some period of time? Jesus he's in present tense. Why are you frightened? Don't you have faith? That becomes significant. Why are you frightened? Don't you have faith? And then there's this shift. They don't answer the question. Right? The question just hangs out there. Don't you have faith? And then it says yet. So I've done all these things and still we have some more stuff to do. Right? Then 41, overcome with awe. They're in the middle of the lake. It's calm now and they're in awe. And they say to each other, again, they're not addressing Jesus. They're talking among themselves. He's asked the question. They have not responded. Now, if you wake me up, at least have the decency to pay attention to what I'm asking you, right? And they say to each other, who then is this? Even the wind and the sea obeyed him. The question comes in some of the other gospels. You've been with me all this time and you still don't know who I am. Like, haven't you been paying attention? Or are we at times so enamored with the miracle that we miss the person who did that? We look at the ends, but we don't look at the means. We don't look at the source of what's going on. And so he's asking them, why are you frightened? You're still not quite there yet. You're in my inner circle and you still don't quite get it yet. There's some other stuff coming that I have to still prepare you for. And in awe, they say to each other, who then is this that even the wind and the waves? Okay. We talked about sabbatical, the learning, the miracle, fear and faith, shalom, power of nature. The identity and revelation becomes important because the parables are being used to teach, but sometimes it takes a while and they still don't have, depending on which gospel we're in. And Mark keeps saying, don't tell, don't tell, don't tell, but I'm telling you, but just don't go share it yet. Where is the identity and the revelation? They still don't get it, not even being close. So I wonder sometimes if we assume that because persons are in every Bible study we ever teach and can quote sermons back to us verbatim, that they really get it. Or do we still allow time to continue to teach, to continue to have the discussion, that we have a sermon talk back, that we listen to our sermons and say, oh, I can see why they don't get it. Let me go back and do a better job of laying this out. Maybe it's the way I presented it. Maybe I was boring and monotone. Maybe I was too expressive. I have to find that sweet spot that when I'm saying something, that my folks, my listeners get what it is. And because you've all been preaching on screens or on phones or whatever, it's much more difficult to read if somebody is getting it because of the flatness. Like right now I have 4 screens going, right? And it's hard to know if what I'm doing is getting where it needs to be. Okay. Thank you, Pastor Brown. Some say, am I supposed to be in the rescue mission? Okay, rescue mission can take time. Very good. What is that? Karen. I'm not gonna butcher your last name, Karen. But it does take time, and we have to understand that. But sometimes we preach as if people don't get it right then and there. There's something wrong with them. But we have to back up and remember faith development. The experiences have been varied and the responses have been varied. And these were people, the majority of the ones on the boat were fishermen, so they understood that these kind of things come up. But this was different. They've been on the lake before, going back and forth. Remember I said there are all those crossings. They've been there before, and still Jesus says, why are you still frightened? Okay. Our experience doesn't mean the absence of any kind of fear. It just means that we might be remembering some things that even calls up other things that prevent us from seeing what the faith stance is right there. Okay. Is it fair to have asked them about fear when Jesus was, Is it fair to ask them about fear when Jesus was asleep? Yes, I think it is. Yes. Because I think that if Jesus hadn't taught, this is my hermeneutic, if they hadn't been present with Jesus, seeing these other things that we now take as development of faith, that we now take as, oh, this is something different, then in my head, Jesus was, in my head, my hermeneutic, Jesus said, I've taught, I've shown, I've related to you one-on-one, I called you for a purpose, and yet there's still something that's missing. And I think maybe in our fatigue, I had this experience yesterday. I was coming back from DC, and I'm questioning as we do, did I do okay in the sermon? I do okay in the sermon, did I do okay? And I get back and I get a text message from someone that didn't get a sermon from 2 weeks ago. So I thought, but I did everything I was supposed to do and other people got it, but that one person didn't get it. So now I'm wondering, what is there that's missing in me first and then in that person? And what do I have to do? What do I need to do to then recalibrate how I'm trying to teach, because they asked about teaching, teach this lesson that I thought was clear, but evidently it wasn't clear to them. So I think for me, it was a fair question. Or the times that I questioned my call after 40 years in ministry, I question my call every 3 or 4 months. I trust God, but then stuff comes up and I question it. So I could see God saying, Teresa Lynn, why are you still frightened? After 40 years, I've been like, why are you still frightened? Because the external voices, remember I said we have to look at the background players, the external voices, there's a group of people and all of them are afraid. And so sometimes we do the Durkheimian collective effervescence. If one person does it, the other person gets it too, right? And so we follow the group, regardless of where we are. Everybody else is running, let me run, right? Without even thinking about it. I think they call it herd something, but anyway, that's where we are. Preaching is the clueless of the disciples. Give us all. There we go. That's it, Ms. Manson. Right, we begin following the group. And we know if we're by ourselves, we've got this thing figured out. And then we get with someone else and the external voices, the outside voices start affecting our inside voice. And here we are, I ask you how they felt. Everything is rocking and reeling. They don't know if they're going to survive. It's like turbulence on a plane. I love God, but when that plane drops so many feet, there's sometimes that I say, God, just put your hand under the plane. I know we haven't dropped, it's like a bad road, but something disquiets me, which is this, maybe I don't want to use the word fear. There's something disquieting about things that come out just all of a sudden. And it shocks me and it overrides my faith. That's why I say by faith quake. It overrides. I don't lose my faith, but something becomes disquieting. And that's what I see in the disciples there. And Jesus must have, because he says, why are you still frightened? Don't you have faith? I don't think he was saying you don't have faith. I think he was saying, what is making you anxious? What is leading you to this conclusion that I don't care about you? And how many of us, even as faithful pastors, preachers, have these times when somebody's sick or somebody's died, or you get your appointments changed, that you have that question about, well, wait a minute, I did everything you said and there's a problem right now. So just panic attacks, thank you. Those kinds of things come up. So those are some things to think about, because none of these are all parabolic or stories. None of them are clear. And maybe what we need to do is define for ourselves in our context, not only who God is, those questions I had at the beginning, but what exactly is this faith that Jesus keeps talking about over and over again? Does it mean we never have a question? Does it mean that we are never afraid? Does it, those are hard words, never, never, never. But so let's say, are there times when, like I talked about my ordination, or there are times when a question comes like, God, I was fine. And these people are crazy and I don't need to be around them and they're driving me. I need to give this up, right? Or the times I question retirement and God says, not yet. It's not because I can't do the work. It's like, look, I'm bewildered. I've done my best and people are still not doing what they're supposed to do. So I think that's it. It's not that I don't have faith, but I think those questions in our humanity come up repeatedly, those kinds of questions. I didn't run you through. Oh, how many times do you ask you're asking your friends now, who then is this? The number of persons who possibly asked that question in the last, now we've lived through a whole bunch of stuff, wars and everything else. And for some reason, these last 16 months, I would imagine this question came up a lot. Who is this? Where is God? That you were spared and you didn't have good behavior or sense of what behavior, and you're still here. Even the winds and the waves obey him. Now, I wonder how many storms they had been in before, or was this storm so big that they couldn't imagine it? Growing up in Missouri around tornadoes, when I moved to Colorado, they didn't think tornadoes were too spectacular, but I'd seen damage. I knew to get shelter and they'd stand outside and watch the tornadoes. I believed in God, but I also knew that I needed to protect myself because there's something that came back up. My blood pressure would rise and the palpitations of my heart would start because it reminded me of someplace I'd been before. So I wonder if the disciples were reminded, because they were fishermen, right? They were reminded of someplace else they had been, but this was such a big tossing and turning, because it seems to be when you make up your mind to join with Jesus, we're in the boat, that things seem to be just out of proportion because now you've decided to do that. We ask people a lot when we ask them to decide to be Christians. We ask them big things. And things are going to come up, and sometimes they think they won't run into storms when they are with Jesus. Might it be that? They thought that nothing was going to happen because they're right there with Jesus. They've seen Jesus heal everything, and now we are in a storm. And because he's asleep, then he's just written us off. He was awake with everybody else. We saw him do miracles. So just think about those kinds of things when you're addressing this particular thing. When she found herself confronting, very good, in the turbulence. Yeah. Okay. Any questions on this particular passage before we segue to the next one? Who is God in this passage? Who is God in this passage? What is God doing in this passage? That's what it is. For you, if you're looking at this, let me back up. When you're looking at this passage, who is God? Or maybe I should say, where is God? Let's do where is God? In this passage, where is God? Instigator and consoler, okay? Well, there we go. Where is God, okay? Okay. Part of the question becomes, depending on your theology, if we talk about the Old Testament, God was localized and over there. The New Testament, we're going to this indwelling kind of piece, right? Toward the end of the New Testament. And so in this story, they're going back and forth across the sea, they're between mountains and everything else. So I was asking the question about where for them was God. And if they didn't know, Jesus wasn't the pilot. He didn't row the boat. They are still learning who Jesus is, but they ask, why do you not care that we're dying? So were they asking Jesus as a human being? We're all upset, you're sleeping. How can you be sleeping when this goes on? Like my grandmother, if there was a storm in Missouri, my grandmother would go to sleep like nothing was happening. We're running around like, ah. So are you the one that's supposed to rescue us, or why aren't you also upset about what's going on? Is that a possibility? Is that a possible question for this passage? Right? Because we end the passage with, who is this that even the winds and the sea obey him? So was it when they were waking him up is because they were not awake, but he was so comfortable in where he was asleep. Teacher, not master, don't you care that we're drowning? That's a different kind of question than, why don't you save us right now? Right? He's asleep. They say, teacher, don't you care? Then he gets up and says it, and they ask them why they're frightened. Where's your faith? And then they say, who is this? So was he just one of them that happened to be their teacher? And now they want to know why he was so comfortable that he could be asleep. Just a thought. Okay. Why are you afraid? What's wrong? Okay. Why aren't you afraid? Okay. Any other questions on this passage before we go to the last set, which is a long passage? Anything else? Okay. All right. In my tradition, we say, seeing there are none, we will go forward. All right. This is a long passage of 22 verses. It is also, again, we have the two stories that we've talked about now in three of this is our third passage where we have the three stories that are going back and forth, that we're looking at these things. We know there's the story of the women hemorrhaging, who tried all the remedies in the world. Jesus crossed the lake again. Remember, I said we're going back and forth, and this time there's a large crowd that begins to gather around him. Jairus, one of the synagogue leaders, comes forth and he says, falling at his feet, pleaded with him, my daughter's about to die. Please come and place your hands on her so that she can be healed and live. So he's asking for Jesus. He's asking Jesus, and his understanding of Jesus, the manner of healing that Jesus is going to use. Remember I said Jesus calls them to faith, touches, calls out, looks at the person's faith. I've done that, and then says, go forward. This time, Jairus is asking, he's a synagogue leader, so he's saying, I need you to come put your hands on Jesus. So that's one thing. Sometimes we dictate how God is going to heal us without allowing God to do it God's self, right? He's already said, this is what I need you to do. I need you to stop by the house, put your hands on my daughter, she's gonna live. It says, so Jesus goes with them. People are following because we have these singular stories, but we have to always be aware that there are multiple people and we don't have all the stories of who was healed, right? There are 40 healing miracles in the New Testament. Jesus was around more than 40 people. These just happen to be these stories that made the cut, right? And so the swarm of people's around Jesus, crowding in on him, and a woman who was there had been bleeding for 12 years. We know the significance of 12 years. She suffered a lot under the care of many doctors and had spent everything she had without getting any better. In fact, she had gotten worse. Because she had heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothes. She was thinking, if I can touch his clothes, I will be healed. Her bleeding stopped immediately. She sensed in her body that her illness had been healed. Second story, at that very moment, Jesus recognized the power that had gone out of him. He turned around the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? Disciples said, don't you see the crowd pressing against you? Yet you ask who touched me. But Jesus looked around carefully to see who had done it. The woman, full of fear and trembling, came forward, knowing what had happened to her, fell down in front of Jesus, told him the whole truth. He responded, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace, healed of your disease. Now, we start with the story of Jairus, and his daughter. He's telling them telling the religious leader. A religious leader is telling Jesus how to affect change. He was a believer. He didn't oppose Jesus, but what becomes significant in these stories is the manner in which the healing takes place, who's asking for it, who are the other characters in this particular text. God bless the disciples, and sometimes I speak not so great about disciples, but this woman is unclean. We're back at unclean. because of her hemorrhaging. We know in Leviticus 15, it talks about emission of blood as being unclean. There was a period of time when a woman was menstruating that she had to be away from people. This woman had been going through this for 12 years. So that means for at least 12 years, instead of cyclically, for 12 years, she was castigated as unclean. She couldn't come into the church because it was written, this was what happened, right? Then we're going to go to a child who was unclean also. And in these miracle studies, Jairus and Bartimaeus are named, everybody else doesn't have a name. The woman won't have a name, the little girl won't have a name. Okay, so we have this first story, and you know the first story, so let me go back. Talk through her story. All right, you already know because people do this. I don't know why we only do it for Women's Day, but people do this. She had lost hope. We have a person who had been unclean. That means that people of faith could not be around her. So she had been isolated for a while. Because if you're with an unclean person, you also become unclean. We're not told about anything about her family, status, any of this stuff. She must have at one time been a person of means because it said she'd exhausted all of the medical people that she could have gone to. She'd exhausted that. It says that she'd gone to all these people, spent everything that she had getting better. So she must have moved from one class to another class, like people that don't have health care, right? So we have that. In fact, she'd only gotten worse because her body's being depleted of all kinds of things over this period of time, and different things happened to her, right? We don't know if she had access to good food or all these other kinds of things, but evidently she'd exhausted everything. So she may have been in Jairus's class, but now not anymore. It says she'd heard about Jesus. So the word had evidently spread because it said a crowd was coming around him. So the word had spread about this person who affected these kinds of changes in people. She's unclean because of her hemorrhage. Let me pause for the cause right there. What were the smells in this story up to this point? What were the smells in this story up to this point? I see nobody putting it. There we go. C, 11:14. Smells. Let's go. Thank you. Mhm. Okay. Thank you. Verse 27 becomes important in that it says because she had heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothes. There was a crowd swarming around Jesus. It says that in the text. He was surrounded by people. Because of her unclean state, that means that people in the crowd must have known something about her, because perhaps they parted ways when she came up behind Jesus. Other than that, how could she get there? I don't know if she was shoving people out of the way, but if she was unclean, she's in a city that most of the people must have done because she'd been that way for 12 years. So perhaps they moved aside so that she could in fact get to where Jesus was. Comes up behind him. In different passages, in different ways, in different commentaries, she is, what do you think? How do you think she sounded going through the crowd? What kind of sounds was she maybe emitted going through the crowd? Yeah. Mhm. How does desperate sound? Those of you who are putting desperate in, how does desperate sound? Okay. Kissing, yeah. Because after 12 years and a loss of blood, her body was probably emaciated as well as in a lot of pain. Okay. You've already done those kinds of things about sound. She came up. It says in the Common English Bible, she was thinking, if I can touch his clothes, I'll be healed. And evidently she was, because it says in the next verse, her bleeding stopped immediately. So before she has a conversation with Jesus, she's healed. We note that in the text. It wasn't, if I can touch, I will be healed. It says she came up behind him. She was thinking, if I can touch, I will be healed. And then this particular version says, immediately it stopped bleeding. It doesn't go through, she reached out and touched. This just says, when she thought about it, she was healed. Is that not what you see in that particular text? She sensed in her body that her illness had been healed. So we have to think through, what does that mean? When does healing take place? What does healing look like? There's a question for you. What does healing look like? What does restoration look like, since you put that in the chat? What does freedom look like? Okay. Yeah. What does amazement look like? What does confidence look like? What does newness look like? So we use these, sometimes we as preachers use words that mean one thing to us, but people might need a little bit more. So when we're doing this multi-sensory engagement, you have to paint the picture, to say what it is, able to walk upright, straightened, okay, right? So confidence is a good word, but what does confidence look like? How do you know that someone is confident? How do you know that someone's renewed? How do you know that somebody's clean? So push yourself to use metaphor and simile that gives some sense of what that's all about, right? She pushes away through the house, comes up behind him in the crowd and touched his clothes. That was 27. She was thinking, if I can touch his clothes, I'll be healed. And her bleeding stops immediately. Was the healing, think about this, did the healing emanate from the touching of the clothes, the thinking about healing, touching of the clothes, thinking about healing, or her motion in the first place? Think about where this miracle takes place. What affected the change, right? She'd heard about Jesus. She'd gotten worse. She'd heard about Jesus, came up behind him in a crowd, touched his clothes. She was thinking, if I can touch his clothes, I'll be healed. It says that healing stops immediately. And she senses that in her body. So now, do we have, or as part of the mystery of God, that we don't know when healing happens? Like if you talk to doctors, they'll tell you, we call death, but we don't know when it happens. We predict when somebody's going to be born, but we can't do it right down to the second, unless, of course, I'm doing a C-section, right? Those kinds of things. We know there's conception, and we estimate conception. So do we estimate healing, is my question. Yes, it is a process, right? Okay. She sensed in her body that she has been healed. In your own experience, since we're describing healing, think about how you know there's a change. There are these old hymns about there's a wonderful change in my life has been wrought since Jesus came in. What does that mean? What does it mean that I'm changed? What does that mean? Think about that. What does that mean to say that one is changed, or I feel a change, or I used to be this and now I'm that? We use these theological, they become theological treatises about change and conversion. What is conversion? And so she's moved from one state to another because it says she sensed in her body that her illness had been healed. Okay. Now it says, this is very clear, it says her bleeding stopped. It doesn't say that her body rebounded yet. That's the process I think somebody put up there, right? Did it get back to normal? People have asked me when I've done several webinars and preaching workshops, what will preaching look like when we get back to normal? And I said, there's no return to normal, because I don't use the term God's next. When I had my rotator cuff repaired, my shoulder is healed, but it's not the same as it was before, because they took something out in order for me to have mobility in my shoulder. So think about, for you, does healing mean we return to normal, or are we different? Does healing mean we go back to where we were and go forward? What does that mean? What does change mean when you're preaching that? What happens to us interiorly and around us? It's kind of like looking at the healing story of the man at the gate, beautiful. When he was healed, he had to find a job. People weren't carrying him around anywhere. So he didn't go back to normal, because it said that, or the man in these healing stories, do we go back to something, or do we go forward in something? Just a thought. All right. Verse 30, at that very moment, Jesus recognized the power had gone out of him. What does it mean for power to go out of Jesus? Think about in your head, what does it mean to say, Jesus said the power had gone out of him? Is this a prelude to later where Jesus has to suffer and die for us to be saved? The power, he gives up the spirit. The power is that what this is about? That it says the power had gone out of him. He turned around the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? Now we know Jesus knew. I mean, if that's our theology, that Jesus, Christology, that Jesus knew, right? Who's touched my clothes? So now he's teaching again. His disciples say, blessed disciples, don't you see this crowd pressing against you, and yet you ask who touched me? Jesus looks around more carefully to see who had done it. Okay. The woman, full of fear and trembling, came forward. Now, we also understand that structurally in society at that time, women were not supposed to be alone in public, yet here she comes by herself because she's been an outcast for 12 years. She's by herself. He's a rabbi, and they were not supposed to talk to single women in public. So Jesus is now just tearing apart all the social structures, right? She's coming forward. She's been unclean. She is now, and when you were healed of something, you had to go to the priest for the priest to verify it. She comes forward, fear and trembling, because she knows all this other stuff. Knowing what had happened to her, she fell down in front of Jesus and told him the whole truth about feeling things, right? About some kind of change coming. He responds, daughter. It's critical here because when Jesus used the term daughter, that's a kingdom language. He calls her daughter. He's bringing her into the kingdom language. Your faith has healed you. He didn't say my touch has healed you. He didn't say anything. He said your faith has healed you. Go in peace, healed from your disease. It's a faith move. Again, we're back at these kinds of questions. 12 years, outcast. Jesus says to her, stepping out across the bonds of society, your faith has healed you. Another definition of faith. And we won't get into people's understanding of faith healers or anything like that. But anyway, that's where we are there. 12 years. So now we skip to the next story, which is again having something to do with 12. I'm not into numerology, so you can do that on your own. But now we're going to look at, this is a woman who had money, spent all of her money, and now she was a lower class in society. Now we're going to shift to Jairus, whose daughter was part of an upper class because he was a religious leader. So we're going to talk about accessibility. She'd been afflicted 12 years, the little girl's 12 years old, and they're both going to be called daughter in verses 24 and 34. While Jesus, now Jairus had come before this encounter with a woman and said, my daughter is sick, can you come? While Jesus is speaking, messengers came and said, oh, your daughter died. Why bother the teacher any longer? Right? They accepted the fact that the child was dead. You don't have to ask Jesus. He didn't have to come to the house or anything like that. Don't even worry about that. The daughter's dead. Jesus overhears all of this and says, don't be afraid, keep trusting. So now we have trust. In the face of death, Jesus is saying, don't be afraid, keep trusting. He's present tense. The daughter had died. He's using present tense. Don't be afraid, keep trusting. Now, he had been in a crowd, but now he's going to do this separate from the crowd, right? So we have, it says they came to the synagogue, he takes with them Peter, James, and John. They go to the synagogue leader's house. He's hearing all the noise of people wailing and people are mourning and all this. And he says, what's all the commotion? Now they're grieving the little girl. He doesn't want a lot of people to follow him. He says to the crowd when he gets there, why are you weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep. This becomes a controversial statement when we see this as a resurrection and we put it next to the larger resurrection story, because there are people that say Jesus didn't die, he was asleep. So you have to think about what you mean by resurrection or what that means. Here he's saying the child is not dead, she is only sleeping. What does sleep mean? When you study sleep, sleep is sometimes looked at as a rehearsal of death, because we lose all control once we go to sleep. We've given over control. They do all these sleep studies and stuff like that. She is asleep. Was she in a coma? I don't know. Do they understand? I don't know. But sleep is temporary. Death is permanent. And then they start laughing at Jesus. We had the scribes and one of the other stories that were challenging Jesus. The people in the room, I don't know if they were doing hearty laughs, but it was like, you have to be kidding. She's obviously dead. They start laughing, and they don't believe what he is saying, but he told them all, get out. I love when Jesus does that. And it says, taking the child's parents and the disciples with them, he goes into the room and extends the hand, Talitha Kuma, right, in Arabic, little girl, get up. And it was used by he's using common language here that they know, and he took the child's hand. So he's touching this child. That violated Torah law because the child was looked at as dead. He's now violent. First, he's talking to a woman in public for healing. Now he's touching a child who was dead. And according to Torah, you were not supposed to touch bodies. So we had an unclean woman, and now this little girl is unclean because she's dead. All right, we talked about unclean spirits earlier today, right? In the Torah, you were not supposed to touch a dead body until evening or for 7 days, right? Jesus has done a taboo by touching the corpse. It says immediately, this word immediately. Another thing to look at is, what do you mean by immediately? Sometimes we use the word suddenly or immediately in healing stories, and we have people in our congregations who are not healed immediately. Right? It's a process, but that word immediately, so we have to look at what the time means with that word. Immediately she stood up and walked, and she was 12 years old. Mark always says that he uses immediately 27, 28 times in the gospel. She's 12 corresponds with the woman. And when she gets up, he gave them orders not to tell anyone what had happened and told them to give her something to eat. Now, the people knew the girl died. This is complex for me. They said the girl died. Jesus said she's sleeping. Jesus touches her. She gets up, and he says, don't tell anyone about the healing. How do you not know that the little girl is healed? It's just a question for me. It's a question. She's going to be running around someplace in the next day or so after she gets her strength back. But Jesus says, don't tell. So I'm wondering if he was saying, don't say it was me. Maybe you can use another story that, she was in a coma, but he's saying, do not tell, give her something to eat so her strength comes back. So we have these kinds of two unclean, upper class, lower class, 12, unclean woman, unclean girl, Both were called daughter. The woman was healed in public. The little girl was healed at the house. And Jesus says told the woman that she was healed, told the parents not to tell what had been done. So you have to work through why this was, but you can see this is like, we use this story as one of the resurrection. You can use this story as one of the resurrection stories that are in the Gospels prior to the crucifixion. But it depends on how you want to say that, because he's saying, don't do it. Why would Jesus tell the people not to spread the healings? And he may not have been ready, according to the way this is written, to talk about, because he starts talking really about his messianic kind of mission in Mark 8, but this is in Mark 5. So it may be a timing for when this announcement is going to be made. We have to think that through. 11:30. Possible topics for this are healing. What do you mean by healing? When does healing take place? Accessibility. The accessibility I'm looking at is how one languages the health issue that the woman had and how she got to Jesus in the first place. Okay. Social disparity, have I talked about already? Resurrection, faith, and revelation. The woman's faith that if she could just get there, everything was going to be all right. Then we have this, the people came, didn't say a doctor came, the people came and said, Jairus' daughter is dead. Jesus says, why are you weeping? Why are you mourning? We're going to hear that later. Why are you mourning? And then touches. Jairus had asked him to touch. Takes her by the hand, says, get up. Don't tell anybody. One's public, one's private. Both are the same kind of source in society. Let's go back to this story, and we're going to do multisensory real quick. Okay, you see the words with people crying and wailing loudly. I want you to work on a metaphor for wailing loudly. Do not say crying or weeping. What does wailing sound like? What does wailing sound like? Do not use cry or weep or sling its knot and falling out. I don't want that. What does wailing sound like? Robert, yes, I would use authority. You could use authority there and family also. Thank you, Robert. I just didn't want to miss that question. High-pitched moan, piercing, Blue Jay Street. Thank you. Okay. Sirens at midnight. Thank you. Okay. They were shocked. He gave us yours. All right. You are the child's parents. You're the child's parents. Notice that we talk about Jairus going to, because he could go out in public and ask this, but it says parents in the text. So there's a mother there present too. What does joy what does joy look like in these parents that had their child restored to them? What does joy look like? Okay. Thank you. Someone asked the question about a possible topic. Yes, authority and family. And I think community also can be a topic, because the community was gathered as this child was sick. They're the ones that brought the information to the dad that the daughter had died. And they're the ones that immediately began weeping. And then I wonder what they felt like when Jesus said, "What's wrong with you? Why are you wailing?" And then tells them to leave. Have you ever tried to break up a crowd of mourners? This is like the peace be still piece, right? To tell people, you don't have to worry about, stop crying. We're real good at telling people to stop crying, right? We're real good at that. Why are you doing this? It's not, it was like, it depending on, again, how it was said, it might be interpreted as being flippant or being callous. So think about the kinds of emotions in these two stories that one might attach to Jesus. What kind of emotion would you attach to Jesus addressing we're not even going to the healing, Jesus addressing to the crowd when he came up and said, "Why are you weeping?" What kind of label? I know you don't want to say bad things about Jesus, but there are a couple of times, like when Jesus called somebody a dog, that Jesus was dealing in his humanity there. So what kind of label would you, mild impatience, okay? We saw impatience when we were on the boat, and now we're seeing this, okay. It was almost as we get closer to this messianic thing that there even seems to be some, in his humanity, some fatigue. Like you probably have some fatigue when you preach the same thing for a whole year and you see no change, right? When you're tired of preaching. Now, I don't see anybody putting anything in the chapter because you don't want to talk bad about Jesus, right? So I'd ask you to add, what emotion would you attach to Jesus in this story? Okay. All right, confidence. All right, thank you. I knew it, yeah. Thank you. I was wondering those. I also wonder what is it like for you when you understand something, but you can't disclose it yet. When you understand that this child was not dead, this child was sleeping, and I know that I can do something to help the situation, but I can't tell anyone. Can you imagine that kind of tension, that spiritual, yes, muzzle, that spiritual tension that one might have when God has said to you, this is what's going to go on. People aren't going to understand it, but you can't tell them how this is going to work right now. Stuck. Thank you very much. Okay. So again, we're back at this mystery. There's no clear-cut answer for things. This is how the restrained joy. Thank you. This is how these things work themselves out. So in this, we have again the two stories. I'm summarizing now. The two stories. Somebody added family and authority to possible topics. I agree with that totally. Let me go this. We have faith. We look at the multi-sensory pieces, but also attune to the emotions that are happening in the text, or what you perceive as the emotions in the text. Now, the parents are elated. They have their child back. Jesus says, don't tell anyone, and please feed her. So we're back at caring for, Jesus is caring for the spiritual, and now he's caring for the physical. The earlier stories where people were upset because there was no food and Jesus had to do the spiritual work. At the end of this, Jesus has done the spiritual work with healing the daughter and giving some kind of orders of what to do. And then he's attending to the physical. So maybe we should eat after church. I don't know. Anyway, questions. I think questions. I'm going to stop my share so I can see you all. Questions? Jokes? My throat is raw.
folks have questions for Dr. Fry Brown? Comments? If you do, just unmute yourself and say your name and go ahead and ask your question. I will say, Dr. Fry Brown, all this talk about eating, I haven't had breakfast this morning and I'm starting to get hungry. So
I haven't either, so I can't wait. Thank you.
yeah, I don't have a question, I have a comment. And it will lead, I guess, to a question, but one of the hardest things that I find is you touched on this, but about, preaching with your context, but also knowing your context. Can you just say a little bit about, these texts affect us in different ways, but the context can also change how we preach it, especially when we build trust in those contexts. And when I think about some of these healing stories, some of these stories, especially those whichevers that you were talking about, people have used these texts as texts of terror against LGBTQIA people, people of color, people who have mental illnesses. So I'm just trying to form that into a question of how do we narrate that into a way to unpack that in a way that's helpful, but not overly psychologizing the text and building trust within the community of the people we preach to. That's a lot to ask, but.
Oh yeah, but that's okay. You're the bishop, so I'm going to do this. Okay. One of the things that I do, particularly in my introductory classes, is talk to people about doing a demographic survey of their congregations, to know more than somebody shows up at 5 o'clock, to know, to do a quarterly, just a real quick little thing about who's there, who's working someplace, what are the ages, and also to be aware of the theologies that operate within a congregation. Because some of the pushback we receive from sermons, because we don't understand that we may have this aggressive whatever and somebody else may be conservative, we can still worship together, we still love each other in our own family, but be aware of that, because the way you articulate something can be looked at as offensive. When we look at things such as the mental illness or some of these healing texts, I just finished a class on prophetic preaching where I had people actually study words that can be used. Language becomes critically important. Ask people what they want to be called. Talk to someone that's in the group that you are now associating with that text. Ask questions of people. Understand you're not the only one that has used the text before. Do some reading. Look at how people, events are represented in media, on social media, and television, because people bring those images to them. Filter your illustrations, which is why I was having us try to begin to work on our own illustrations, so we're not just using some canned illustrations. Jesus used parables in context. So even though somebody else that you're in a lectionary group may use a parable, use an illustration in their context, it may not work for yours. So make sure that it is tailored to the people with whom you preach on Sunday, and not just because a new movie came out. Right? You're preaching with the people, not at the people. So you need to know the people with who you have a heart. And even when I travel around, I talk with the pastor before I get to a church about who their congregation is, about what's going on in the congregation, so I know. And those of you there week after week, things change. You have a different congregation every week. I'm very clear about that, because you change every week too. And so because you used it last week does not mean it's going to fly this week. And you get those cute little text messages, and your people probably send you emails before you finish preaching. So that's the contextual piece. We're all going to make mistakes, but if we say something that has offended someone and we know that we really have made a blunder, it helps to apologize, not do an apologetic for 55 minutes, but to say, I misspoke. This is the term I should have used last
That's
week.
really helpful. Yeah.
Because if not, it continues to accumulate and people wait for you to offend them so they can use more fodder against you. But if we're honest, we're human beings, and we're not going to hit it 100 every week. We're just not.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I think Pastor Michael navigate the rest of it.
There's two comments here. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I know there's two comments here in the chat box, one from Nathan. Can you see that, Dr. Fry Brown? And then we'll get to you, Robert.
What do you think
Miss,
your experience would be like to just tell Mark 5 story using all the kinds of metaphors that help us experience? I think it depends on your context. Some contexts don't want you to do narrative. They want you to do more expository kind of work. They want you to never touch the biblical text, God forbid. It depends on your context. So if you want to do the narrative storytelling of a Fred Craddock, that's up to you. I personally will delve more into the background and the connective tissue with other texts as I'm telling this story. Metaphors are good, but doing a sermon with all kinds of metaphors may miss some people. But if your group is into a lot of poetic kinds of things, you could probably do that method. Free of all, okay, wait a minute. There was another question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I can ask the question out loud.
Good, because I couldn't see it.
So I struggle in preaching to talk about the messianic secret, because sometimes it seems to get into the weeds of scholarship. And I like what you're saying about trying to tie that to the concrete circumstances of the people in the text. You know, what was it like to hear that from Jesus? But I struggle to figure out how to apply that to us today. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how to preach in a kind of, how does that apply to our discipleship here and now?
I always think about we're reading back on a text and circumstances. It's like I'm a historian, so my interpretation of history is different than the people that experienced it. And for me to think that they should have known doesn't make sense to me, because I wasn't there, but I can read back on the scholarly kinds of assessments of that. But I have to look at the people as humans in that circumstance, right? When they write about what happened these last 15, 16 months, some people are going to say, why in the world were they afraid? They didn't experience it. All they're going to have is all that writing up to that point. And so I try to humanize, when I ask the question about who's in the text, I try to humanize the text to say, what were they really experiencing when it was going on? And maybe they missed it because, like I said before, they'd already been on the water. And they knew that some people die in the water, some people survive in the water. But I'm reading back on the text and I go, well, why didn't they know that Jesus was the one who's going to calm the sea? I've been singing this song for 40 years. I know it. And I think that's what we do. And so I think even the phrase messianic secret sometimes gives us a superiority over the people that are in the text that don't know, right? Because we had a class that told us what that was. And I think that it's also kind of like when preachers think, we talk about this secret, preachers think they have to know all the answers. Well, maybe we're still figuring out what that secret is. And so we have to be human enough to say, I don't know. And the disciples did not know. We can intuit that they were learning. But again, part of that was it wasn't time to be revealed. We don't know all of that because even the last text we had, Jesus said, don't tell. And that's why I said, but the child's going to be up running around. Does she have to stay in the house for 4 days? And 2 chapters later, he's going to tell about it. So we have to really, I think, I talk about us walking around in the text to see all the aspects of it without using that terminology, without using messianic secret. Walk around the text and see. There are other people that probably saw some things that we don't know what they told. Somebody was running and telling the Sadducees and Pharisees, or they wouldn't in chapter 8, and up the ante on trying to get rid of Jesus. Somebody said something. If you're in a church, you know that even if you say, this is a secret, don't tell anybody, before you leave the house, everybody knows it. And then they act like they don't know it because you said don't say anything. That's what I see operating.
thank you for that. Robert, please, I know you've had your hand raised for a little while.
Yeah, thank you so much for a great presentation. My question really deals with Jesus in terms of Jesus in his ministry pushing the envelope. My question is, how do we remain edgy or risk-taking in our preaching?
I think by even by having, as my mother would say, the temerity to say, God told me to say something, that's edgy. So if you mean, are we going to confront? Are we going to talk about? The model that Jesus has depends on you and your context. I'm in a denomination, I'm the historiographer, executive director, research and scholarship for my denomination. I can say some things that local preachers can't because I'm not waiting on an assignment. So my answer is not going to be that of a local pastor. When I was a local pastor, I could, but right now you need to eat next week. And so so it depends on how much you can risk, number one, how much your congregation supports you when you want to be quote unquote edgy. Or they are going to go to the bishop and say, get rid of Robert because, right? And so I think that you knew before you were in ministry what God was pushing you to address. And sometimes we hide behind ministry and say we can't do it anymore. So you're the same person with a new title and a position. So if you're a person that addressed, I'm a social justice freak, but I also try to look at all sides of something before I address it. And because I show up in spaces as a Black woman who's ordained, I'm already edgy. And because I don't have anything to risk because I'm tenured, I'm already edgy. And because I'm the next step from a bishop, I'm already edgy because I can show up. But there are other people that aren't in those social positions to do that yet. So you have to worry, you have to learn how to address what the text says, and you cannot address it the same way your person down the street does, because your people will get rid of you. Or sometimes the people are out being edgy and the pastor's playing catch up. Because they're doing things, right? They're doing things in society and we're sitting back waiting because we're fearful. So in knowing your context, you will know how much to say, and language is your friend. Language is your friend. You don't have to use trigger words, but you can say the same thing if you employ language. So you don't have to say race, you don't have to say sex, you don't have to say sexuality, you don't have to, you have enough language, you have 80,000 words in your capacity that you can describe anything you want to talk about and not use the word people are waiting for. Best trick.
Thank you, Mary. We do have to, sorry, we do have to wrap up here in just a minute. I know Pastor Brown raised their hand, so this will be the last question, and then we'll wrap up here. So, Pastor Brown, you have your hand raised.
Just a brief comment rather than a question. I want to appreciate the sensory exercises, the ability to go and hear, to see, to think and feel and smell that which is being presented, because that takes me closer to the text where I need to be. And also I appreciate the warning of not pulling scriptures out of one place and then putting them in another and trying to make them fit. And with regard to the sensory exercising, one more time, the illustrations can come out of us if we understand all that we are asked to see, think, hear, smell, taste, and see. Thank you, Dr. Frybrown.
Thank you.
Yes, well, thank you everybody for participating. We put in the chat a brief survey, a survey link, it's very brief. And also we provide these at no cost. If you'd like to make a donation, there's a link in the chat box as well to make a donation. But we want to thank everybody. Bishop Strickland, are you here with us still?
Dr. Frybrown, we have drank from the well and it's been deep this morning, and we have been well satiated, and we are grateful for you. And if you would like to know more about Dr. Frybrown and her work, you can go to Candler School of Theology's website, and there's a whole host of resources there about all the beauty that she's been part of. But if you would join me in giving thanks to this scholar of the church and this dear prophet. So we are really blessed by you this morning. So thank you so much. I know Zoom is hard for all of us, but 3 hours of Bible, you've kept us interested. And now I'm hungry from all this talk about food. So thank you. But friends, I wanted to remind you that we're working on 2 more of these for the summer, one for the July lectionary and one for August. I'm still trying to confirm both of those professors, and we'll let you know as soon as we get that confirmed. But God bless you all, and may you have a really remarkable day living in joy. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.